There's a moment that comes to every person, usually in the depths of night or in the quiet hours of early morning, when they realize they're living beneath their potential. It's not a comfortable realization. It arrives with the weight of wasted days, abandoned goals, and the gnawing sensation that somewhere inside them exists a person they've never met, a stronger, more capable version of themselves that remains locked away behind walls of hesitation, comfort-seeking, and fear. Most people experience this moment and then do nothing. They acknowledge the feeling, perhaps make a mental note to do better tomorrow, and then slip back into the familiar patterns that got them there in the first place. The alarm goes off and gets snoozed. The workout gets postponed. The difficult conversation gets avoided. The creative project remains untouched. Day after day, year after year, the gap between who they are and who they could be widens until it becomes a chasm so vast that crossing it seems impossible. But there exists a method, a psychological override system that can hijack the brain's natural resistance to difficulty and force action even when every fiber of your being screams for retreat. This isn't about motivation, which is fleeting and unreliable. This isn't about discipline, which can be depleted like a muscle worked to exhaustion. This is about understanding the architecture of human resistance and building a system that makes doing hard things not just possible, but inevitable. The story of how this method came to be understood begins not in a psychology laboratory or a self-help seminar, but in the lived experience of people who found themselves at the absolute edge of their capacity and somehow pushed beyond it. Part 1. The Anatomy of Resistance. On a Tuesday morning in March, a man we'll call Marcus sat in his car in the parking lot of a gym he'd been paying for but not attending for 8 months. His membership card was in his wallet. His gym clothes were in the bag beside him. The building was less than 50 feet away. And yet he couldn't move. This wasn't laziness. Marcus worked 60-hour weeks as a software engineer. He managed a team, met deadlines, solved complex problems. He wasn't afraid of hard work, but somehow the simple act of opening his car door and walking into that gym felt insurmountable. His mind generated a cascade of reasons. He was tired from work. He'd eaten too recently. His shoulder felt slightly off. He should wait until Monday to start fresh. He needed to research better workout routines first. Each excuse felt legitimate in the moment. That's the insidious nature of resistance. It doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like reason. It feels like prudence. It feels like your mind protecting you from discomfort, which, in a sense, it is. What Marcus didn't understand then, but would come to learn, is that the human brain is fundamentally designed for energy conservation. Every calorie burned in our evolutionary past was a calorie that might mean the difference between survival and starvation. The brain developed sophisticated systems to prevent unnecessary expenditure of energy. Comfort, familiarity, and the path of least resistance aren't personality flaws, they're deeply embedded survival mechanisms that served us well for hundreds of thousands of years. But in the modern world, where food is abundant and physical threats are rare, these same mechanisms have become chains. They keep us locked in patterns that no longer serve us. They make us reach for our phones instead of our books. They make us binge streaming services instead of building skills. They make us choose the easy path so consistently that we forget there's any other way to live. Marcus sat in that car for 23 minutes. Finally, he started the engine and drove home. He felt relief first, then a familiar wave of self-loathing. He'd failed again, and in that failure, he'd reinforced a pattern. His brain had learned once more that generating excuses led to the reward of returning to comfort. The neural pathways that govern avoidance grew stronger. The version of himself that could walk into that gym became more distant, more theoretical, less real. That night, searching online for answers to his paralysis, Marcus stumbled across a concept that would change everything. It wasn't a motivational speech or a productivity hack. It was a simple observation from a military trainer who had spent decades teaching people to function under extreme stress. The body will always signal discomfort before it's actually in danger. The override happens when you acknowledge the signal and proceed anyway. This idea, acknowledgement without obedience, became the foundation of what would emerge as the override method. To understand why this works, you need to understand the mechanics of resistance. When faced with a difficult task, your brain initiates a threat assessment. It doesn't matter if the threat is a predator or a conversation you've been avoiding. The same neural circuitry activates. The amygdala, your brain's alarm system, sends signals that manifest as physical sensations. Tension in the chest, heaviness in the limbs, a desire to flee or freeze. These sensations aren't random. They're your body preparing for danger. Stress hormones flood your system. Your heart rate increases. Blood flow redirects to major muscle groups for potential fight or flight. And critically, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational decision-making and long-term planning, gets partially suppressed. In a true emergency, you don't need to think, you need to react. But when the threat is actually just a challenging workout, a difficult work project, or an uncomfortable social situation, this physiological response works against you. You feel all the signals of danger, but the danger is imaginary. Your rational brain knows this, but it's being overridden by more primitive systems. Most advice about doing hard things focuses on fighting these feelings, on pushing through, or being tougher. This approach treats resistance as an enemy to be defeated through force of will. And sometimes it works, for a while. But willpower is a finite resource. Every time you force yourself to do something against your brain's threat signals, you deplete your capacity for future decisions. By evening, after a day of forcing, your reserves are empty. You make poor choices. You give in to impulses. The cycle continues. The override method takes a different approach. Instead of fighting resistance, you work with it. You understand it. You acknowledge it. And then you bypass it through a systematic process that doesn't require willpower, at least not in the traditional sense. Marcus began experimenting with this approach the next morning. When his alarm went off at 6 a.m. for an early gym session, he felt the familiar pull toward the snooze button. But instead of either forcing himself up or surrendering to sleep, he did something different. He lay there for exactly 30 seconds, actively noticing every sensation his body was producing. The warmth of the bed, the heaviness of his limbs, the desire to sleep. He named each feeling mentally. This is comfort resistance. This is my brain trying to conserve energy. This is not danger. And then, without any internal debate or negotiation, he stood up. Not because he felt motivated, not because he had convinced himself it would feel good, but because he'd decided the night before that when the alarm went off, standing up would be the action that followed. The decision had already been made. This morning was just the execution. This might sound simple, even obvious, but it represented a fundamental shift in approach. Marcus wasn't trying to change how he felt. He wasn't attempting to generate motivation or enthusiasm. He was simply separating feeling from action. He could feel resistant and act anyway. The feelings didn't need to change for the behavior to change. He drove to the gym. The same cascade of excuses appeared in his mind, but now he recognized them for what they were: automatic processes, survival mechanisms, the voice of his brain trying to keep him comfortable. "Thank you for trying to protect me," he thought, acknowledging the excuses without engaging with them. "But I'm not in danger." He went inside. He worked out for 30 minutes. It wasn't enjoyable. He didn't experience a runner's high or feel particularly accomplished. He was simply present with the discomfort, acknowledging it, not fighting it, not surrendering to it, just allowing it to exist while his body did the work. And then he went home. The whole experience lasted less than an hour, but something fundamental had shifted. Over the next weeks, Marcus continued this practice, not just with the gym, but with every point of resistance in his life. The difficult conversation with his manager about a raise, the creative project he'd been avoiding for months, the early morning wake-ups, the healthy meals instead of convenient junk food. Each time resistance appeared, and it always appeared, he used the same approach: acknowledge, name, proceed. What he discovered was that resistance didn't actually decrease. The feelings of discomfort didn't go away. His brain didn't stop generating excuses, but his relationship to these experiences changed entirely. Resistance became information rather than instruction. His feelings became weather patterns he could observe rather than commands he had to obey. This distinction is crucial. Most people assume that successful, productive, accomplished individuals must have different feelings than they do. They imagine that disciplined people wake up excited to work out, that confident people don't feel fear before important presentations, that productive people don't feel the pull of distraction. This is a fantasy that keeps people trapped. The truth is that everyone experiences resistance. The difference is in what you do with it. The weak self, the version of you that cannot be relied upon, that breaks promises to itself, that lives beneath its potential, is defined entirely by its obedience to comfort signals. It feels tired, so it stays in bed. It feels anxious, so it avoids the challenge. It feels hungry, so it eats poorly. It feels distracted, so it scrolls. Feeling and action are fused together into an automatic response loop. This version of yourself is a passenger in your own life, carried along by whatever sensations happen to be strongest in the moment. The strong self, the version that the override method builds, feels the exact same sensations, but maintains a space between stimulus and response. It feels tired and gets up anyway. It feels anxious and speaks anyway. It feels distracted and focuses anyway, not through superhuman willpower, but through a systematic process that makes action independent of feeling. Marcus described the shift this way. I used to wake up and ask myself, do I feel like going to the gym? Now I wake up and the question is already answered. I'm going. The only variable is whether I'll notice my feelings along the way or not. This pre-decision framework became the first pillar of the override method. You don't make important decisions in the moment of resistance. You make them in advance, in a calm state, when your prefrontal cortex is fully online. Then, when the moment arrives and your primitive brain starts generating escape routes, there's nothing to decide. You're simply executing a decision that's already been made. But pre-decision alone isn't enough, because even with advanced commitment, the moment of resistance can be overwhelming. You can know intellectually that you're going to the gym, but when the time comes, your entire nervous system might be screaming for you to stay home. This is where the second pillar comes in, the 5-second rule. The 5-second rule isn't about counting backwards, though that can help. It's about understanding the window of override. Research in behavioral psychology has shown that resistance follows a predictable pattern. When you encounter a cue for action, an alarm, a calendar notification, a moment of decision, you have approximately 5 seconds before your brain shifts into rationalization mode. In those first 5 seconds, the decision is relatively clean. You can act almost on instinct before the excuse-generating machinery fully spins up. But after 5 seconds, the rationalizations begin. And they're convincing. They're your own thoughts, in your own voice, using your own logic. I'll do it later. I'm too tired right now. This isn't the right time. I should plan better first. Each excuse feels legitimate because it is coming from your own mind, and you trust your mind. But what you're hearing isn't your wisdom. It's your resistance disguised as reason. Marcus learned to recognize the 5-second window. Alarm goes off. 5 seconds. Stand up. No negotiation. Meeting reminder pops up for a difficult conversation. 5 seconds. Stand up. Walk to the office. No debate. Gym time arrives. 5 seconds. Grab bag. Walk to car. The action begins before the excuse engine gets warmed up. This doesn't mean moving thoughtlessly or recklessly. It means that the thinking has already been done. The decision has been made. The 5 seconds is simply the execution window. Inside that window, you're not deciding whether to act. You're simply acting on a decision that's already complete. The third pillar emerged from Marcus's observation that resistance comes in waves. The initial moment of difficulty is usually the hardest, getting out of bed, walking into the gym, starting the difficult task. But once you're in motion, the resistance often decreases. Not always, and not permanently, but enough to make continuation easier than initiation. This led to what became known as the 10-minute rule. When facing a difficult task, commit only to 10 minutes. Not the full workout, just 10 minutes of movement. Not the entire project, just 10 minutes of work. Not the whole conversation, just 10 minutes of engagement. This does two things. First, it makes the commitment small enough that your resistance has less ammunition. Your brain can't generate as many compelling reasons to avoid something that only requires 10 minutes. Second, and more importantly, it gets you past the initiation threshold. Once you're at 10 minutes into a workout, you're warmed up. The hardest part is over. The momentum is there. You'll often continue well beyond 10 minutes, not because you forced yourself, but because continuation has become easier than stopping. But even if you stop at 10 minutes, you've won. You've proven that resistance doesn't control you. You've maintained the pattern of doing what you said you'd do. You've deposited another brick in the foundation of your stronger self. These 3 pillars, pre-decision, the 5-second window, and the 10-minute rule, formed the basic architecture of the override method. But the method itself was still incomplete. Because motivation and willpower and technique only get you so far. The deeper transformation requires something more fundamental, a change in identity. Part 2. Destroying the weak self. 6 months into his practice of the override method, Marcus faced a crisis. He'd been consistent with his morning routine. He'd lost 20 pounds. He'd gotten the raise after having the difficult conversation. He'd launched the creative project he'd been avoiding. By any external measure, he was succeeding. But internally, he felt fraudulent. Every morning was still a battle. He still felt the same resistance. He still had to consciously apply the method, step by step. He'd assumed that at some point it would get easier, that eventually he'd become the kind of person who naturally did hard things. Instead, he remained the person who had to force himself, who had to override, who couldn't trust himself to act without a system. This realization brought him to a dark place. What was the point of all this effort if he was fundamentally unchanged? He was acting differently, but he still felt the same. The weak self hadn't been destroyed. It had just been temporarily suppressed. And he was exhausted from the constant suppression. He almost quit everything. He was within one morning of returning to old patterns, of accepting that maybe he was just the kind of person who needed to live with unfulfilled potential. But something stopped him. A conversation with an old mentor who asked him a simple question. Who are you when no one is watching and nothing is at stake? Marcus had no answer. He realized he'd spent so long trying to perform strength that he'd never actually examined what strength meant. He'd been mimicking the behaviors of disciplined people without understanding the internal architecture that made those behaviors natural. That night, he wrote down a list of every way he'd betrayed himself in the past year. Every time he'd said he'd do something and didn't. Every promise broken to himself. Every moment he'd chosen comfort over growth. The list was long, painfully long. Looking at it was like seeing all the ways he'd failed to be someone he could respect. And then he understood something crucial. The weak self isn't destroyed through action alone. It's destroyed through betrayal. You betray it. You systematically break every promise it makes, refuse every comfort it offers, deny every excuse it generates. You starve it of the cooperation it needs to survive. This sounds harsh, perhaps even violent, but consider what the weak self actually is. It's not a part of you that deserves protection. It's a collection of patterns, neural pathways that have been reinforced through years of choosing comfort over growth. It's the voice that has kept you small, kept you safe, kept you from becoming who you could be. And it speaks with your voice, which makes it difficult to recognize as an enemy. The weak self masquerades as self-care. It tells you that you deserve rest when you haven't earned it. It tells you to be realistic when realistic means settling. It tells you to listen to your body when your body is simply signaling discomfort, not damage. It uses the language of wisdom and moderation to keep you trapped in mediocrity. Destroying this self isn't about self-hatred. It's about self-love. At a deeper level, loving the person you could become more than you love the comfort of remaining who you are. Marcus realized that every time he'd successfully applied the override method, he'd been betraying his weak self. Every morning he got up despite wanting sleep. Every gym session he completed despite wanting to skip. Every difficult conversation he had despite wanting to avoid. Each of these was a small betrayal. And cumulatively, they were weakening the grip of the patterns that had controlled him. But he'd been doing this unconsciously, almost apologetically. Part of him still listened to the weak self's arguments, still felt bad about not giving in to them. He was fighting a war while trying to make peace. Now he decided to fight consciously, deliberately, with full commitment to victory. He started by mapping out every pattern that needed to be broken. The snooze button, the evening scroll sessions, the weekend laziness, the avoidance of difficult work, the social anxiety that kept him isolated, the self-doubt that prevented him from taking risks. Each pattern was a habit loop: trigger, action, reward. And each pattern was maintained by the weak self's control of his response to discomfort. The override method gave him the technique to break the loops. But he needed something more, a mindset shift that made breaking them feel not like deprivation but like liberation. This is where the concept of the incompatible self became central. Marcus realized he couldn't become the person he wanted to be while maintaining the behaviors of the person he was. The version of himself that hit snooze every morning was fundamentally incompatible with the version that built a successful business. The version that avoided difficult conversations was incompatible with the version that had deep relationships. The version that chose comfort over challenge was incompatible with the version that achieved meaningful goals. These weren't two sides of the same person who could coexist. They were competing identities, and only one could win. Every single decision was a vote for oneself or the other. Hit snooze, vote for the weak self. Get up, vote for the strong self. Skip the workout, weak self. Completed. Strong self, avoid the challenge. Weak self, face it. Strong self. When framed this way, every choice became clear. Not easy, but clear. Because Marcus no longer wanted to be the person who voted for weakness. Not because weakness was morally wrong, but because weakness led to a life he didn't want to live. The weak self would give him comfort in each moment and misery over years. The strong self would give him discomfort in each moment and satisfaction over years. Put that way, the choice was obvious. But knowing the right choice and making the right choice are different things. This is where the practice of deliberate betrayal comes in. Deliberate betrayal means actively seeking out and violating the weak self's preferences. It means getting up earlier than you need to, just to prove you can. It means taking cold showers not because they're healthy, though they might be, but because they're uncomfortable and your weak self hates them. It means choosing the harder path when an easier one is available solely to demonstrate that comfort isn't your master. This practice sounds extreme, and in some ways it is, but it serves a specific purpose. It builds evidence of your own sovereignty. Every time you act against the weak self's preference, you prove that you are not merely a passenger carried along by impulses and feelings. You prove that there's an you that exists above and beyond the reactive patterns. You prove that choice is real. Marcus began practicing deliberate betrayal in small ways. When his weak self said, "Check your phone," he left it in another room. When it said, "Sleep in on Saturday," he got up even earlier than usual. When it said, "Order takeout," he cooked. These weren't always necessary actions. Sometimes the phone check or the sleep in or the takeout would have been perfectly reasonable. But that wasn't the point. The point was to establish clearly who was in charge. Over weeks, something shifted. The weak self's voice grew quieter, not because it had been reasoned with or convinced, but because it had learned that speaking was pointless. It could generate all the excuses it wanted, produce all the comfort signals it could manage, and the result would be the same. Marcus would act according to his pre-made decisions, not according to his momentary feelings. This is the mechanism by which the weak self is destroyed, not through understanding or acceptance or integration, but through consistent, unwavering betrayal. You starve it of obedience. You refuse to negotiate. You make it powerless by demonstrating over and over that it cannot control your actions no matter how strongly it controls your feelings. And here's what's remarkable. As the weak self weakens, the strong self doesn't have to work as hard. The override becomes more automatic, not because you've built motivation or generated enthusiasm, but because you've eliminated the internal opposition. When there's no voice arguing for quitting, continuation becomes natural. When there's no impulse toward comfort that requires suppression, choosing challenge becomes effortless. Marcus described it as the difference between swimming upstream and swimming downstream. Initially, every action against resistance felt like fighting a current. The override was possible, but exhausting. After months of consistent betrayal of the weak self, the current reversed. Action became the default. Resistance still appeared. It always appears, but it was more like background noise than a compelling argument. This state isn't permanent, and it isn't absolute. The weak self never completely dies. It's always there, waiting for a moment of weakness, a crack in your practice, an opportunity to reassert control. This is why the override method can never be abandoned. It's not a temporary fix that creates permanent change. It's a permanent practice that creates sustained transformation. But the practice does evolve. What begins as conscious, deliberate override eventually becomes semi-automatic execution. You still feel resistance, but you barely notice it. You still experience the pull toward comfort, but you don't seriously consider following it. The gap between deciding and doing shrinks until it's almost non-existent. This is when something profound happens. You begin to trust yourself. Not in the sense of trusting that you'll always feel motivated, or that doing hard things will become easy, but trusting that, regardless of how you feel, you'll do what you've committed to doing. This self-trust is the foundation of all achievement, all growth, all meaningful change, and it's only built through repeated proof. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you deposit into a trust account. Every time you break a promise, you make a withdrawal. Most people are running massive trust deficits with themselves. They've made and broken so many commitments that when they say, "I'll do it," even they don't believe it. The weak self has learned that promises are meaningless, that words don't translate to action, that commitments are just intentions that will be abandoned when they become uncomfortable. Destroying the weak self requires rebuilding this trust through consistency. You must become someone who does what they say they'll do, especially when it's hard, especially when they don't feel like it, especially when no one else would know or care if they didn't. This reliability to yourself is what transforms the override method from a technique into an identity. Marcus reached a point, about a year into his practice, where he rarely thought about the method consciously. He'd wake up at 5 a.m. because that's when he woke up. He'd work out because that's what he did. He'd tackle difficult tasks first because that was his pattern. The behaviors had become integrated into his identity. He wasn't someone trying to be disciplined. He was someone who was disciplined. But he noticed something else too. The strength he'd built internally began to show up externally in unexpected ways. Criticism that would have devastated him before barely registered. Setbacks that would have made him quit felt like temporary obstacles. Challenges that would have paralyzed him with anxiety now felt like interesting problems to solve. This is the profound truth embedded in the subtitle of this method. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. When your actions are no longer controlled by your feelings, external circumstances lose their power over you. Someone's criticism can't stop you because you've learned to act despite internal discomfort. External discomfort is just more of the same. Failure can't paralyze you because you've trained yourself to continue through the feeling of inadequacy. Setbacks can't discourage you because you've built an identity that persists regardless of temporary conditions. The weak self can be destroyed by anything. A harsh word, a setback, a moment of doubt. It's fragile because it's dependent on favorable conditions. It only acts when it feels motivated, safe, confident. When those conditions disappear, so does the action. The strong self, built through the override method, is anti-fragile. It doesn't just withstand difficulty, it grows stronger through it. Each override builds the neural pathways. Each betrayal of comfort weakens the resistance. Each kept promise strengthens the trust. Difficulty becomes the training ground rather than the defeat. This doesn't mean you become immune to pain or struggle. You don't stop feeling. If anything, you might feel more intensely because you're not numbing yourself with distraction and avoidance. But feeling and being destroyed are different things. You can feel hurt without being wounded. You can feel discouraged without being stopped. You can feel afraid without being paralyzed. The destruction of the weak self creates space for something else to emerge. Not a bulletproof persona that feels no pain, but a resilient core that continues functioning regardless of pain. This is the ultimate form of strength. Not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to be vulnerable and still act. Marcus found this played out in his relationships. He'd always struggled with confrontation, avoiding difficult conversations, until resentments built up and relationships exploded. The weak self had controlled this pattern. Feel discomfort, avoid the conversation, choose temporary peace over long-term health. But as he destroyed his weak self, he found himself able to have the difficult conversations, not because they stopped being uncomfortable, but because discomfort no longer determined his actions. He could feel anxious and speak anyway, feel uncertain and be honest anyway, feel vulnerable and stay present anyway. And paradoxically, this made him stronger in others' eyes. People respect someone who can face difficulty without flinching, not because they're impressed by machismo or stoicism, but because they recognize the presence of real strength. When you're no longer controlled by the need for comfort or approval or safety, you become solid. People sense it. They might not be able to articulate it, but they feel it. This isn't about becoming hard or closed off. In fact, the destruction of the weak self often leads to becoming more open, more honest, more genuinely connected, because you're no longer protecting a fragile self that could shatter under scrutiny. You've already done the hardest work, the work of not giving yourself a pass, of holding yourself to your own standards, of refusing to let yourself off the hook. After that, other people's judgments feel like small things. The weak self seeks external validation because it doesn't trust its own assessment. It needs others to affirm that it's good enough, successful enough, worthy enough. This creates a desperate dependence on approval that makes you manipulable and controllable. The strong self, forged through consistent override and betrayal of comfort, doesn't need external validation in the same way. Not because it's arrogant or self-sufficient, but because it has an internal measuring stick. Am I doing what I said I'd do? Am I keeping my promises to myself? Am I choosing growth over comfort? These metrics are objective and internal. They can't be manipulated by others' opinions. This independence is what makes you undestroyable. Others can't break you because you've already done the breaking. You've shattered the weak version of yourself and built something stronger in its place. They can criticize you, but you've already been harder on yourself than they could ever be. They can reject you, but you've already rejected your own excuses and comfort seeking. They can try to discourage you, but you've already persisted through your own discouragement hundreds of times. When you've mastered the art of forcing yourself to do hard things, everything external becomes just more data, more information, more challenges to navigate. Nothing can stop you because you've learned that the only real obstacle was always internal, the weak self that needed comfort more than progress. Remove that obstacle, and what's left? Part 3. The practice of servant action. 2 years after beginning his practice, Marcus found himself in a situation that would have destroyed his former self. His company was acquired. His position was eliminated. His carefully built routine was disrupted. The future he'd been working toward dissolved overnight. The old Marcus would have spiraled, would have seen this as confirmation that effort doesn't matter, that the universe is random and hostile, that there's no point in trying. The weak self thrives on these narratives. It uses setbacks as evidence that comfort was the right choice all along. See? It says, "You worked hard and it didn't matter. You should have just taken it easy." But Marcus had spent 2 years training for exactly this moment. Not this specific scenario, but for any moment when circumstances turned against him. The override method hadn't been about achieving external success. It had been about building internal sovereignty, the capacity to choose your actions regardless of conditions. He felt all the appropriate feelings: shock, anger, fear, uncertainty. He didn't suppress them or pretend they didn't exist, but he didn't let them determine his actions either. The morning after receiving the news, his alarm went off at 5 a.m. The weak self whispered, "You're in crisis. You need rest. You deserve to sleep in." He got up anyway. He went to the gym anyway. He did his morning routine anyway. Not because these actions would solve his problems. They wouldn't. But because maintaining his practice was more important than any single event. The routine wasn't the point. The sovereignty was the point. The demonstration that external circumstances don't control internal actions. That was the point. Over the following weeks, as he navigated the job loss, he used the override method in reverse. Instead of forcing himself to do difficult things, he forced himself not to do comfortable things. The urge to scroll job listings frantically for hours, the impulse to complain to everyone who would listen, the desire to blame others for the situation. Each of these urges felt compelling, felt justified, felt like reasonable responses, but he recognized them for what they were: the weak self trying to reassert control during a moment of vulnerability. The weak self loves crises because crises create permission for regression. Normal rules don't apply during hard times, it says. You can skip the workout.
You can eat poorly. You can waste time.
You're going through something. Marcus refused the permission. Not because he was trying to be superhuman or prove something, but because he'd learned that crises are precisely when practice matters most. When things are going well, maintaining good patterns is relatively easy. Anyone can be disciplined when circumstances are favorable. The test of real strength is whether you can maintain your standards when everything is falling apart. This is where the override method moves from being a self-improvement technique to being a life philosophy. It's not about optimization or productivity or achievement. It's about something deeper. The question of whether you are the author of your life or merely the subject of it. Most people are subjects. Things happen to them and they react. They're pushed and pulled by circumstances, by feelings, by other people's expectations. They do what they feel like doing when they feel like doing it. They think they're free because they make choices, but their choices are entirely predictable based on what's most comfortable in the moment. Sovereign action is different. It's action that originates from a decided self, not a reactive self. It's choosing based on values and long-term goals rather than momentary states. It's the capacity to be the author of your own story, rather than a character swept along by plot developments. This sovereignty is built through the daily practice of override. Every morning you override the urge to sleep in. You prove you can author your own day. Every time you override the impulse to avoid difficulty, you prove you can author your own growth. Every time you override the craving for instant gratification, you prove you can author your own future. But sovereignty isn't absolute. You can't control everything. The acquisition that cost Marcus his job happened regardless of his practices and preferences. But sovereignty means controlling what can be controlled. Your response, your actions, your standards, your practice. In the Stoic tradition, this distinction was central. You can't control external events, but you can control your character. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control what you do about it. This isn't resignation or passivity. It's the opposite. It's the recognition that real power lies not in controlling the uncontrollable, but in perfecting your response to it. The override method operationalizes this philosophy. It's the systematic practice of building responsibility, the ability to respond rather than react. And it starts with the smallest moments: the alarm going off, the difficult task appearing on your list, the uncomfortable conversation waiting to be had. Marcus found new work within 2 months. But the job wasn't the victory. The victory was that he'd maintained his practice throughout. He'd proven to himself that his strength wasn't dependent on favorable circumstances. He'd kept every promise to himself, even when keeping those promises seemed pointless. It demonstrated that his identity, the strong self he'd built, was real and durable and independent of external validation. This is what it means for a man to destroy his weak self and become indestructible. Not that nothing bad happens. Not that failure becomes impossible. Not that you stop feeling pain or fear or doubt, but that nothing external has the power to make you abandon yourself. You become the one constant in a variable world. And that constancy is a form of strength that others can sense but not easily describe. People began coming to Marcus with questions. How had he stayed so steady during the transition? Where did his confidence come from? What was his secret? He'd try to explain the override method, the predecisions, the 5-second window, the 10-minute rule, the deliberate betrayal of comfort. Some people understood. Most didn't. They were looking for a motivation hack, a shortcut, a way to feel differently so they could act differently. But feeling differently wasn't the path. Acting differently despite the feelings, that was the path. And it was a path most people refused to take because it required them to stop negotiating with themselves, to stop believing that their feelings were valid reasons for inaction, to stop waiting for the right mood or the right moment or the right circumstances. The truth that Marcus had learned through his practice was this: you already have everything you need, not in terms of resources or skills or opportunities, but in terms of capacity. You could already do hard things, you just don't, because you've spent years training yourself to obey comfort signals. You've reinforced the neural pathways that make resistance feel like wisdom. You've built an elaborate architecture of excuses that feels like rational thought. Destroying the weak self is really just demolishing this architecture. It's seeing through the sophisticated lies that your brain tells you to keep you safe and comfortable and small. It's recognizing that the voice saying you can't, or you shouldn't, or not now, isn't protecting you. It's imprisoning you. And once you see this clearly, once you understand that your resistance isn't wisdom but just conditioning, you can begin the work of reconditioning. Not through massive willpower or perfect discipline, but through small, consistent overrides. 5 seconds at a time, 10 minutes at a time, one decision at a time. The accumulation of these small overrides creates something remarkable, a life that reflects your values rather than your impulses. Days spent doing what matters rather than what's easy. Years that build towards something meaningful rather than just passing comfortably. A self you can trust and respect rather than one you're always disappointed in. This isn't a dramatic transformation. There's no moment when you suddenly become a different person. It's more like water gradually carving through rock. Each override is barely noticeable, but thousands of them reshape everything. The channel deepens. The path becomes clear. What once required enormous effort becomes almost automatic. Marcus was 3 years into his practice when he realized he'd stopped thinking about the override method as a method. It had just become how he operated. Resistance still appeared. It always would, but it felt like background music rather than a compelling argument. His weak self still tried to negotiate, but its voice had become so faint and predictable that he barely noticed it. This is the end point of the practice, though it's never truly an end point because the practice never stops. You don't reach a place where override is no longer necessary. You reach a place where override is so integrated into your identity that it doesn't feel like overriding anymore. It just feels like being yourself. The strong self, the sovereign self, the self that can't be destroyed by others. This isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a direction you commit to. Every day presents new opportunities to choose it or abandon it, new temptations to return to comfort, new justifications for lowering your standards, new crises that offer permission to regress. And every day, you have to choose again. Not because the choice gets easier, but because the choice is what builds the self. There is no version of you that exists independently of your actions. You are what you do repeatedly. If you repeatedly choose comfort, you become someone defined by comfort seeking. If you repeatedly choose difficulty, you become someone defined by capability. The override method isn't really about forcing yourself. That framing suggests an internal civil war, one part of you dominating another through superior force. What it's actually about is clarity, seeing clearly that the weak self serves no useful purpose. That comfort in the moment creates misery over time. That resistance isn't protecting you from danger, it's protecting you from growth. Once you see this clearly, override isn't force, it's choice. You're not forcing yourself to do something you don't want to do. You're choosing the want that serves your long-term interests over the want that serves your momentary comfort. Both wants are real, both are yours. But one leads to the life you actually want to live, and one doesn't. Destroying the weak self is really just letting one set of wants starve. You stop feeding the impulses that keep you small. You stop validating the resistance. You stop negotiating with the part of yourself that will never be satisfied with growth, because growth is inherently uncomfortable and it only wants comfort. And what emerges in the space left by the weak self isn't some perfect superhuman version of you. It's just you, but more aligned. Your actions match your values. Your days reflect your priorities. Your life accumulates towards something rather than just passing. You become someone you can trust, someone you can count on, someone who does what they say they'll do, especially when it's hard. This person, the one who has destroyed their weak self through consistent practice, really is indestructible in the ways that matter. Not because nothing can hurt them, but because nothing can make them abandon themselves. They've proven, through thousands of small overrides, that they can face difficulty and continue. They've demonstrated that their worth isn't dependent on success or approval or favorable circumstances. When you know, not hope or believe, but know from repeated experience, that you'll keep your promises to yourself regardless of how you feel, external obstacles become remarkably less threatening. Job loss is just a problem to solve. Rejection is just information to process. Failure is just feedback to integrate. None of it can destroy you because you're built on something solid, the demonstrated capacity to act according to your values rather than your impulses. This is the ultimate promise of the override method. Not that life becomes easy or that you achieve all your goals or that success is guaranteed, but that you become solid, reliable, sovereign. You become someone who can be counted on, first and foremost by yourself. And that foundation, that unshakable trust in your own capacity to act despite resistance, is worth more than any external achievement. Because achievements can be taken away, circumstances can change, other people can disappoint you. But once you've built a self that you can trust, once you've destroyed the weak version that betrays you, you have something that can never be lost. You have yourself. And that, finally, is enough. The practice continues. The resistance never fully disappears. The weak self is never completely dead, always waiting for a moment of inattention to whisper its seductive lies about rest and comfort and lowered standards. But you know now what those lies lead to. You've lived on both sides of the divide. You've experienced both the misery of constant self-betrayal and the deep satisfaction of self-trust. Given the choice, clearly seen, the path forward is obvious. Not easy, never easy, but obvious. And that clarity is what makes the override method not just a technique, but a way of life. Not just a practice, but an identity. Not just a method for doing hard things, but a method for becoming someone who hard things cannot break. Every morning, the alarm goes off. Every morning, the weak self suggests that today could be different, that you've earned a break, that you can start again tomorrow. Every morning, you have 5 seconds to answer. The answer determines everything, not because this one morning matters so much, but because 10,000 mornings accumulate into a lifetime. And a lifetime of consistent answers, consistent overrides, consistent betrayals of comfort, consistent choices for growth over ease. That lifetime builds something indestructible, Not a person without weakness. Not a person without struggle, but a person who struggles and continues anyway. A person who feels the weakness and chooses strength anyway. A person who has destroyed their weak self, choice by choice, morning by morning, override by override. And that person cannot be destroyed by others, because the hardest work, the work of becoming someone you can trust, has already been done. The war has been won, though individual battles continue daily. The transformation is complete, though the practice is lifelong. You don't force yourself to do hard things. You become someone for whom doing hard things is simply what you do, and that person, built through thousands of small overrides, is indestructible in all the ways that actually matter. Not because they're superhuman, but because they're finally fully human, sovereign, solid, and unable to betray themselves even when no one would know or care. The secret was never really about force at all. It was about clarity, consistency, and the slow accumulation of proof that you are who you say you are. That's the override method. That's the destruction of the weak self. And that's the path to becoming someone that others and, more importantly, you yourself, can always count on.